The Joe Rogan Experience.
My pleasure. So tell me what's up. Are we in trouble? What's going on, man?
No, it's World War III. Haven't you heard?
Is it?
Yeah, no. No, it's not. No, I'm here to burst that bubble, I think. Not that anyone's going to say, okay, I'm writing this down. Mike said no World War III. But it was amazing how fast I'll put that closer there. It was amazing how fast the narrative came out.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we'd barely smoked Soleimani, and suddenly the current president's going to get us into this conflict. And
I was nervous.
Well, I think everybody stepped back because it was such a shock to the system, right?
Yeah.
When was the last time we dealt with Iran in this fashion? I mean, as opposed to like a harshly worded démarche or a note or maybe an extra sanction here or there. But it was such a strange development that I think it did, and the natural reaction was to say, oh my God, here we go. And certainly everybody's exhausted from 19 years out there. So, but,
I was shocked that Trump could make that call because they had a bunch of different options. They're like, or we could kill him. He's like, let's kill him. Well, I was like, whoa, I didn't know you could do that.
Well, you know what? He's been a target before.
Yes.
Soleimani is. I mean, there's. I guess I should first say where I stand on this, which is I'm not mourning his passing. Right? I mean, I think he deserved it. I think it's justice that should have been served up some time ago. He's responsible, not just for, as people have talked about, the hundreds of U.S. servicemen, but thousands and thousands of people. This guy was a completely bloodthirsty douchebag. I mean, there's no way about it. And we're talking about the second most, structure-wise, the second most important person within the Iranian regime, next to the Ayatollah. So, but the idea that somehow we took out a foreign leader, right, or a military general like he was some sort of Eisenhower, is insane. The guy was a mob boss. He was the head terrorist for a state that is the number one sponsor of terrorism around the world. And so, but he's been on target lists for a long time. You go back to, I think, 2008, there was an operation to take out a guy named Mugnia, who himself was also a bloodthirsty psychopath. And he was running Hezbollah operations. So the Israelis had been tracking him, as had we. And at one point, they had an opportunity to take out Mugnia and also Soleimani. And they backed off at the time, essentially because the U.S. wouldn't, get behind the idea that we're going to take out Soleimani. That was, at that point, that was a step too far. So they eventually we got Mugnia. But Soleimani is just, I don't even know where to start with the amount of blood that he's responsible for. People talk about, again, okay, he authorized operations and activities in Iraq against U.S. soldiers and against Iraqi soldiers and Iraqi civilians. But it goes back to the beginning of that. I mean, you could go back to 2003. And Soleimani was the architect. He dreamt up this idea as the U.S. was going into Iraq that he was going to, what he did was insane. He basically authorized, he's in charge, right? So he authorizes the release of a bunch of Sunnis that they've been holding on to, Iran being Shiite, arch rivals being the Sunnis, essentially. And the Saudis are their arch enemy, a Sunni nation. But he released all these Sunni extremists that Iran had been holding on to, essentially ever since we had gone into Afghanistan, right after 9/11. And he released them into Iraq, including a guy named Zarqawi, who became the head of al-Qaeda in Iraq. And within a few months of our getting out to Iraq, these Sunnis, under Soleimani's tutelage, had a series of bombings and started bombing everything from Shiite mosques to UN facilities, a Jordanian embassy, a variety of targets, killing thousands of Shiites. Now, he's a Shiite, right? So this is how bad this guy is. He goes into Iraq with this plan that I'm going to push the Shiite in Iraq to Iran. I'm going to make them come to us for protection, for coverage, essentially. We can ride in there because what does he want? He wants to exert their influence within Iraq. He doesn't want a strong Iraq. He doesn't want the U.S. in there building a strong, stable Iraq. You go back to the Iran-Iraq War where Soleimani started his military career. And, he's not, there's no way, he's a true believer. There's no way he's ever going to let Iraq become stable again. And he's insane enough that he kills thousands of Shiite, his own people, right, in order to push the Shiite population in Iraq to Iran. I don't know if I may not be being eloquent enough, but
false flag operations. Who's he blaming? These
it's not the Sunnis. It's the Sunnis are doing it.
He's blaming
Sunni extremists.
On the Sunnis.
Yeah, but he's authorized and he's pushed them into Iraq to do this. And so he was always very unusually capable at walking a fine line between his own Shiite beliefs, population, everything, and at times being able to be sort of a puppet master for Sunni extremists when it suited his cause. And it's fascinating stuff. And whether it was dealing with Hezbollah or the Palestinian Islamic Jihad or whomever, he again, I keep going back to the same thing. He deserved what he got, no doubt in my mind. And I'm just surprised it didn't happen sooner. Maybe not from us, but from others. They just back in October, the Iranians, claimed that they foiled an assassination attempt against Soleimani by Israel and some unnamed Arab agents. So it's not as if we just plucked his name out. He'd spent 2 decades, engaged in death and mayhem.
Now, the take on him dying has not been like the take on Baghdadi. And Baghdadi, one of the most disturbing things that I saw was the Washington Post called him an austere religious scholar. Did you see that?
Yeah.
When that guy died, they called him an austere religious scholar. And people that I talked to that understand who he was and what was going on there were fucking fuming. They were like, what is this? Who the fuck wrote this?
Right.
Like, you're talking about a goddamn terrorist, a real legitimate murderous terrorist, and you're calling him an austere religious scholar.
Right. You're giving him this credibility. So I don't understand that either. I saw that, and I talked to a handful of people who, kind of leaned in that direction. And also, you get the same thing with Soleimani. Now, Soleimani, I can understand. He's wrapped in the cloak of a military uniform, and, people saw him sitting next to the Ayatollah, and okay. But I look at it the same way. This is not assassinating a foreign leader. This is not assassinating a revered scholar. These are taking out terrorists, bloodthirsty terrorists who have a long track record of killing people. And it's not he was not he was not choosy, right? With Soleimani, we're talking about again Iraqis, Yemenis. Syrians, his own people. I mean, they talk about maybe some 1,500 or so protesters, being killed in Iran in the past few months as a result of the protests against the Iranian regime, primarily because of corruption. The fact that they've driven that economy into a toilet at the expense of the Iranian people, lack of rights of any sort, and Soleimani again as the head of the Quds Force. And the number 2 person there, he's responsible. So I don't understand anybody who doesn't just say, yeah, and I think the left had a hard time with it. The hard left, you saw them spinning a little bit saying, okay, we don't say he shouldn't have gotten it. We don't say he didn't deserve it. But, and then they had to try to figure out some way because it's all got to be about politics now. So they had to bring it back to the current president, to Trump.
Well, whenever Trump does anything, even if what he does is fantastic, they can't get behind it. They almost have to go against things that are great. Like, if the economy is great, they've got to find a reason why it's bad that the economy is great. Yeah. And if his decisions lead to something positive, they can't accept it. Yeah, it's unfortunate.
Well, we've lost our ability to, I think, to look at things just in an objective fashion, in any sense of the word objective. Or certainly we don't have civil conversations anymore, but the idea that we can look at and separate the politics from it. Look, I don't care whether people like Trump or not. I didn't vote for him. I don't necessarily care for the individual, but that doesn't mean I can't like policies.
Right.
And whether you're talking about what's going on with Iran, whether you're talking about the way that we've been dealing with China lately, other issues, I liked President Obama. Didn't like his policies. I don't necessarily like Trump. I like his policies. I don't see any conflict there. Right?
Yeah.
But anyway.
No, I don't see any conflict there either. I mean, people are complicated, and I just didn't know that Trump could make the call. Like, he could be the guy that goes take him out. Like when I thought that was like there was probably a panel of military leaders and like really important people that understand the ramifications.
Yeah.
Not a fucking game show host.
Yeah, like in America's Got Talent or something.
Yeah.
There's 4 people sitting there hitting a buzzer. You know.
I felt like that it would be like something that they would discuss. Not that Trump would be like, yeah, option 3, fuck them.
Well, but they talk about it, and there is a great deal of conversation that goes on, not necessarily with the president. You know, I have no idea how he processes his information, but there's a great deal of conversation and discussion that goes on in the Pentagon, within the intel community, and National Security Council. You know, what happens once they lay out these options in front of the president? You know, I don't have a clue, but he does have that authority. He's got that ability, and President Obama had that authority. President Obama took out, remember, you know, U.S. citizens, you know, who were, you know, overseas in the Middle East, and they were, you know, there was a hue and cry over sort of the legality of it, but you didn't see a lot of people saying, you know, and in part, okay, I admit, because it wasn't, again, this, you know, Soleimani's wrapped in the cloak of his military uniform. And
well, it's also
different.
People are very concerned about this possibility of us going to war with Iran, and they think that this might have like started that off.
Yeah, I think what changed the calculus here is Iran is, you know, the regime is brutal and awful. They're not crazy. And the one thing they want more than anything else is to retain power. That's it. And I think they looked at the idea of a military conflict, a direct military conflict with the U.S. And this is not to say that their proxies won't, you know, strike out at us someplace around the world at some point. But the regime looked at that and thought, nah, you know what, we're not going to do this. In part because, you know, the killing of Soleimani is important on a much bigger level than just taking out, you know, a terrorist of his stature. It's important for deterrence purposes, and so, you know, I think they looked and felt like the calculus in dealing with the U.S. has shifted now, and they don't understand it. They're not comfortable with it, and also they can't afford it. Look, if we got in a military conflict, that was the idea that, you know, somehow we were going to get in World War III. It would be over in an evening. Literally, it would be over in one night. We have the ability to take out their entire energy infrastructure, their missile bases, their key military facilities. And I don't want to oversimplify this, but after that first night's activity, that's it. They're done. So the idea that somehow there's going to be – now, does that mean that, you know, we should do that? Of course not. Nobody wants a military conflict. But, you know, and again, there would be knock-on repercussions, et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully we can sort this thing out through, now that we're doing the military deterrence and they understand that we're serious. We've got the economic pressures. We've got diplomatic pressure, primarily to keep them isolated. I think we're on the right track with Iran. I think we're going to see a different reaction from them.
Well, I was a little bit relieved when they attacked back and just sort of like launched missiles on the outside of bases. Nobody died. I was like, okay, so it seems like this is almost like they're making a signal like they're attacking, but they're not really doing anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there was an optic to it. I think you're right, absolutely, that they felt like they had to do something. Yeah, the Ayatollah's got a, I don't know whether you call it saving face or not, but you know, and we had a warning. We had warning ahead of time.
And didn't they print in their paper? Didn't they say that they killed a bunch of people?
They did
in the missile attack.
Yeah, they claimed about 80 or so. I think.
Great. Keep saying it.
Right, exactly. Just whatever it takes. But then, I mean, you know, but look at the reaction that we've had. You know, of course, the Ukrainian commercial passenger jet went down.
Yeah. And that was them, right?
Oh, that was definitely them.
So do you think that they shot it down because they thought it was a U.S. military plane?
Yeah, it was. Look, this is it. It's not unprecedented. I mean, we shot down an Iranian passenger jet years and years ago, right? The Russians shot down. They still won't admit to it, but they shot down a passenger jet over Ukraine. Just a handful of years ago, which they still won't admit to. It's human error. And it's human error in a conflict zone, in a situation where there's a lot of moving parts, and it's never going to be a zero-risk game. So if the Iranians had done this, as tragic as it is, and come out and said, "Oh my God, we did this," okay, well, it would have been horrific, but they did this to themselves. Because they just couldn't bring themselves to be truthful. They've got a long track record of not. And so they engaged in this and shot it down. When you find missile debris in a field where you're doing an investigation of a plane crash, that's a pretty good indication. And then there's the video on top of that.
Oh, there is a video of the missile hitting the plane?
Yeah, 2 missiles.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
Yeah, 30 seconds apart, roughly 30 seconds apart. So
it took 2 missiles to bring down a plane?
Yeah, it hit the first one. The first one hit, and then about 30 seconds later, not quite 30 seconds later, a second missile hits. There's another fireball, and the plane stays up in the air for a period of time, just because it's not devastated, but it was some 20 miles from the airport. It had actually kind of made as if it was turning back to the airport, probably right after that first missile hit. But here's the thing. That's a tragic disaster right there, right? But the idea that somehow nobody's actually saying they did it on purpose. They didn't do it on purpose. They did it. It was an accident. They mistook it for either an incoming missile or a hostile aircraft, coming in for a bombing run after they launched their ballistic missile strike. So nobody's saying it was done on purpose, but it's indicative of the Revolutionary Guard force and the regime itself, that they spent several days denying it and saying it was mechanical failure and pressuring the Ukrainians to come out and say it was mechanical failure, which they then reversed course on that once it became obvious. So it's a tragic situation. But now the protests out in the streets of Iran, which are a continuation of the past several months, right, which were targeted at a corrupt regime, have picked up strength in light of that, because the people are just we're tired of this.
Yeah.
And who knows where it's going to go. I suspect, unfortunately, I'm fairly cynical about all this. We've been hoping the Iranian population would kind of rise up for decades, and it doesn't happen because it's a pretty brutal regime. We don't understand that. We don't understand how difficult they are, right, and how serious-minded they are about holding on to power. So every now and then we think, okay, here come the protests. It's going to topple the regime, and it doesn't happen. So maybe it's different this time. I don't think so.
Now, were you concerned at all? And this is one of the things when you say that we could go in there and level them in a day. The real issue is their allies, right? The real issue is China and Russia.
Yeah, but they're not going to do anything. China and Russia aren't going to do anything. It's not in their best interest. And they if they're consistent about one thing, both those countries, it's that they act in their own best interest. And they would look at that and go, yeah, I'm sorry. Look, so what are we dealing with in that immediate area? Iran's closest ally is Syria, right? Soleimani spent, billions of, Iranian dollars or money that they couldn't afford to, and that should have been spent on its population, arming, training, equipping, and dealing with the Syrian war and keeping his pal Assad in power. So Iran and Assad and Syria are tied together, but is Syria in a position to somehow rise up and engage? This is not going to be. This wouldn't have been a conflict as we imagine it, right? It wouldn't be a conflict of occupying space and ground and all the rest of it. Nobody wants it. Nobody needs it. It's not good for anybody. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that in the scheme of things, we would have overwhelming superiority. Yeah, and yeah, I can't imagine a scenario where Russia, would come in, and in fact, we would. Probably, as anybody would, we would say, okay, look, the Russian military is in Syria. We're going to liaise with you. We're going to advise you. Shit's coming down, and because the last thing we want to do is drag them into it by hitting some of their facilities or personnel or whatever. So there would be that level of coordination, which there always is, no matter who the parties are. There's always some element of coordination. But anyway, yeah, I don't see that happening. I think we've averted that. I hope we've averted sort of further military, conflict. I think the Iranian regime understands that it's a new day. Perhaps that they'll come to the table eventually. That's what this whole maximum pressure campaign's about, is to again create sufficient economic pressure, ensure that they understand the idea of deterrence. Which I think they do after this strike on Soleimani. And that goes back a ways. This wasn't just like something that just they thought of after an American contractor was killed. The Iranian regime had been ratcheting up their aggressiveness and their attacks and their various operations out in that region for quite a while, and we had been talking to them about it or getting the signal to them that you've got to stop this. And back in December, they were told, look, if you continue this path, we are going to take serious action. And we did.